The Romanian Revolution, or the Christmas Revolution, was a period of civil unrest in Romania, which was part of a number of other uprisings that took place in countries around the world. It began in the city of Timișoara and then spread throughout the country, and it would result in the trial and execution of the long-standing Romanian Communist Party General Secretary Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena. Nicolae was a dictator of Romania, and his ousting from power saw the end of 42 years of communist rule in the country, and the removal of the last Marxist-Leninist government in the Warsaw Pact country. It was a revolution that overthrew the government and leadership of the country, and also executed its leader, but it's believed that in the actions over 1,000 people died, and also thousands more were injured. But what is the story of the brutal execution of the Ceausescus? Remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Nicolae Ceausescu was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement in his early life. In 1936 he was imprisoned, and then 4 years later he was arrested again for his Communist Party activities. He married Elena Ceausescu, a communist activist, in 1939, and whilst in prison he became the protégé of his cellmate, who became later the communist leader. He managed to escape from prison in August 1944, before the Soviet occupation, as the Second World War was raging on, and he then served as a secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. When the communists rose to power in Romania in 1947, he first headed up the Ministry of Agriculture, and he then served as a deputy minister of the armed forces, as a major general. He then became the second most powerful person in the party's hierarchy. But following the death of the leader, Ceausescu rose to the position of the leader of the Romanian Communist Party. He then became the head of state, and he won popular support for his independent nationalistic beliefs, and he openly challenged the dominance and power of the Soviet Union over Romania. He brought to an end Romania's involvement in the Warsaw Pact alliance, and he also condemned the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact forces, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But then in 1974 he became the president. His police limited free speech, and they tolerated no internal dissent or opposition, and the regime was oppressive, and they outlawed contraception and abortion. With this, maternal mortality rates rose heavily, as women sought unsafe methods to end their pregnancies. Those who did dissent would be sent to prisons where they were tortured and treated awfully, but Ceausescu's government was heavily in debt to foreign governments. They had a number of poorly managed industrial ventures, and with this in 1982, Nicolae decided to export most of Romania's agriculture and industrial production to ease the debts. But this caused extreme poverty and shortage of food, fuel, medicines and basic necessities, to the point where the standard of living in the country heavily fell. Along with this, he appointed many members of his family, including his wife, into positions of power in the government. Elena Ceausescu in government worked as a secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she wasn't important until her husband became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. She accompanied her husband on visits abroad, including state visits to China, and she continued to get roles in senior positions inside the Communist Party. She rose to become the second most important and influential person after her husband, and she was deeply involved in the politics alongside her husband. A cult of personality emerged around the Ceausescus, with Elena being regarded as the mother of the nation, and it's believed that her desire for advancement and honours, and also vanity, was larger than her husband's ambitions. She controlled the way she appeared on camera, and was never supposed to be shown in profile as she did have a large nose, but in March 1980 she became a first deputy prime minister. But tensions in the 1980s were rising in Romania, and protests would break out. On the 16th of December 1989, the Hungarian minority in Timișoara held a protest in response to attempts by the government to evict a Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes. The government claimed he was inciting hatred and wanted to remove him from his post and get rid of him. The crowd became angry and impatient and began to chant anti-communist slogans, and then the police arrived at the scene. But that evening the protests had grown and spread, and the original cause was forgotten. Some protesters attempted to burn down buildings, and the police and security forces responded with firing tear gas and using their water cannons, and the police beat up many of the rioters and arrested them. The group then began a protest march around the city, but they were confronted yet again by security forces. The next day the protests and riots resumed, and they broke into district committee buildings and threw propaganda brochures out the window, and even threw Ceausescu's writings out. The military was sent in to bring the situation to an end, but the situation was getting worse and growing larger. The army failed to establish order, and chaos erupted with gunfire being shot and fights breaking out. There were many who were injured, and cars were being set on fire, but then the tanks were sent in. There was wild shooting from Liberty Square around the city, and helicopters were overhead. Some areas looked like a war zone with blood on the streets, but Ceausescu then left to visit Iran, leaving the crushing of the revolt to his wife and his subordinates. Whilst he was away, martial law was declared and a curfew was ordered, but many defied this, including a group of 30 men who waved the Romanian flag which had removed the communist coat of arms. These were fired upon and some died, and many others were seriously injured. Elena then sent in other officials to deal with the riots, and they agreed to free the majority of arrested protesters, but when Ceausescu returned on the 20th of December, he gave a televised speech expressing his anger for the revolution. On the 21st of December, he then addressed around 100,000 people to condemn the uprising. Busloads of workers arrived and were given flags and pictures of Ceausescu under duress to drown out the protesters. However, Nicolae was out of touch, and many of the crowd began to jeer and boo and whistle insults at him, and then the crowd then roared for the uprising that had begun. He became desperate, but then movement came from the outskirts of the crowd, as did the sound of gunshots, fireworks or bombs, and chaos broke out. The crowd tried to disperse, and there was news that security forces were firing on the crowd as the revolution was unfolding. The speech was broadcast around the nation, and Ceausescu and his wife panicked and were hustled back into the building. The crowd turned into a riot, chanting "Down with the dictator" and "Death to the criminal," and as time went on many more people took to the streets. Anti-terrorist special squads were brought in, and soon the crowd was being shot at by the army from a number of buildings. There were many casualties as victims were shot, clubbed to death and stabbed by government forces. Some were even run over, as one APC drove over the crowd, crushing people. Water cannons were turned on, and then police continued to batter and beat everyone they saw, and intense firing and shooting continued into the night. In the early hours of the 22nd of December, the Ceausescus made the decision to wait until the early morning to flee the city. Before 7 a.m, Elena heard that there were large amounts of workers heading for the city of Bucharest to join in with the protests. Martial law was brought back in, and there was a ban on large groups. However, hundreds of thousands were gathering in central Bucharest. At 9:30, Vasile Milei, the Minister of Defence, died under suspicious circumstances, and many believed he hesitated to follow the orders given to him by Ceausescu to fire on the demonstrators. The new Minister of Defence, Victor Stanculescu, would later refuse to fire on them, which played a pivotal role in the overthrow of the government. He would later claim, "I had the prospect of two execution squads, Ceausescu's and the revolutionary one." However, Nicolae and Elena then headed for the roof of the building they were inside of, and they were to be airlifted off a roof. But a group of protesters made their way into the building and overpowered the bodyguards before heading to the balcony. They were meters from Ceausescu, and the lift's electricity failed before it got to the top. The personal pilot of the president was given instructions to airlift them out of there, but it became impossible to land where he wanted. He later said, "Then Stilica, the co-pilot, came to me and said that there were demonstrators coming to the terrace. Then the Ceausescus came out, both practically carried by their bodyguards. They looked as if they were fainting. They were white with terror. Maniu Manescu and Emil Bobu were running behind them. Manescu and Bobu and another Securite officer scrambled to the 4 seats at the back as I pulled Ceausescu in. I saw the demonstrators running across the terrace. There wasn't enough space. Elena Ceausescu and I squeezed in between chairs and the doors. We were only supposed to carry 4 passengers, and we had 6. They left for Snagov, and when they arrived, Matalan's unit commander said, 'There has been a revolution. You are on your own. Good luck.' Matulan told the Ceausescus he could do no more. The security detail then tried to flag down a car, and they were picked up by a doctor who did not really want to help. He then faked car problems, and they were picked up by another driver, but they were then arrested by local police and were transported to a garrison military compound and held captive until they were placed on trial. The trial of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu was rather brief, and it lasted around an hour. They would defend themselves and were accused of genocide with over 60,000 victims, subversion of state power by organising armed action against the people, offensive destruction of public property by destroying and damaging buildings, undermining the national economy, and trying to flee Romania, using over $1 billion deposited in foreign banks. It was in a sense a show trial, as they were convicted of all charges and were condemned to death. They did not have the chance to choose their own lawyers, and Nicolae would question the authenticity of the court. But regardless of this, the Ceausescus were to be executed for their crimes, and this was seen as a violent and bloody end to the Romanian dictatorship. Just days after the revolution had broken out, they were dead. Elena and Nicolae were executed at 4 p.m. on a military base outside of Bucharest on Christmas Day 1989. The execution was performed by a firing squad which was made up of paratroop soldiers. Hundreds, it's believed, volunteered to take the lives of the dictator and his wife, and Nicolae Ceausescu would state, before that, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade." The Ceausescu's hands were tied by 4 soldiers before the execution. Before the sentence was carried out, Elena screamed, "You sons of dogs," while she was led outside and lined up against a wall, and this wall was against the side of the barrack building. Whilst this was happening, Nicolae sung the Internationale, and as the pair were stood against the wall, the firing squad then began firing quickly. The execution was hastily arranged, and the executioners were trigger-happy, to the point where the television crew, which was there to capture the death sentence, was not ready. In fact, they only managed to capture the last rounds of shots fired from the guns. A retired captain would later tell newspapers that he believed the shots from his rifle were the ones responsible for the deaths of the Ceausescus, because of the 3 soldiers assigned to fire, he was the only one who remembered to switch his Kalashnikov rifle to fire fully automatic. Because of this, at least one of the members of the group hesitated as he fired, and in 1990 it was found that around 120 bullets were lodged inside the bodies of Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu. The execution was deemed to have been carried out quickly, as they were worried that loyalists would try to rescue them. But following the execution, their bodies were covered in canvas, and they were flown to Bucharest and then interred inside a cemetery. The Ceausescus were the final people to be executed in Romania before the abolition of capital punishment on the 7th of January 1990, and their death brought a bloody end to their decades of power over Romania. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.